This is Locke video number 4 on primary-secondary qualities and also on Locke's account of complex ideas. In the last lecture, I talked about Locke's account of the basic elements that come into the mind, the simple ideas of sense and reflection. Those were the atoms and elements that come into the mind, into the dark room or blank slate of the mind. In this video, I'm going to talk about two topics. First, the primary and secondary quality distinction, and I'm going to talk about his arguments that some kinds of qualities, like the red and white in the porphyry statue that you're looking at, are secondary qualities that, in some sense, don't exist in the thing itself. And then the second topic in today's video is going to be Locke's account of complex ideas. That is, how it is that through the operations of the mind, we combine, compare ideas in order to create new complex ideas. Locke begins his discussion picking up from where we left off last time, Book 2, Chapter 8, Section 9. Now he wants to define the primary qualities. He says, qualities thus considered in bodies are first such as are utterly inseparable from the body in what state soever it be. No matter what conditions the thing is in, it's going to have these qualities. So this inseparability is part of Locke's conception here. Such as in all the alterations and changes it suffers, all the force can be used upon it, it constantly keeps. And such as sense constantly finds in every particle of matter which has bulk enough to be perceived, and the mind finds inseparable from every particle of matter, though less than to make itself singly be perceived by our senses. So this idea of this inseparability should remind you a bit of what we talked about in Galileo, when Galileo introduced this kind of a distinction between qualities that are really in the object, especially the motion of particles, and then the sensory qualities, the colors, smells, and tastes, that seem to be in some way subjective. And here Locke is saying whatever the primary qualities are, these would be qualities that are really there. They're the real original qualities, and they're inseparable from it. It doesn't matter what condition the body is in. Now, this idea of that it can undergo changes and it won't, and the primary qualities won't change, that's a little misleading, because that obviously you can, if you alter the shape of something, it's going to change the shape. But what Locke especially means is that it's going to have some shape or other. It's going to have solidity if you divide something apart. And that's what this example, he says, the grain of wheat, that's what that example is supposed to show. So he says here, take a grain of wheat, divide it into two parts. Each part has still solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. Right? So he's not saying it has the same extension, they're not in the same place, but it still has solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. Divide it again, and it retains still the same qualities, and so divide it on until the parts become insensible. And here the term insensible is a term Locke uses again and again, and insensible here means that you can't sense it. And so you could take a synonym for insensible here to be imperceptible or microscopic, in fact. So the parts become imperceptible. They still retain each of the qualities. They still have extension, solidity, figure, and so forth. So in that sense, he's saying this example shows that these qualities, extension, figure, mobility, that these are inseparable from the body itself and therefore primary. So Locke's point is, what does a mill do other than simply mechanically divide grains of wheat into smaller and smaller pieces until you get flower. And Locke concludes the paragraph by calling these original or primary qualities of a body. Right? So you divide it, you can't take away those qualities. He uses other terms too a bit later. These are real, original, or primary qualities, all synonyms. The secondary qualities, hasn't said what those would be yet, but the secondary qualities are, he says a bit later, nothing in the objects themselves but powers to produce various sensations in us by their primary qualities, i.e., by the bulk, figure, texture, and motion of their insensible or imperceptible microscopic parts as colors, sounds, tastes, etc. So far he hasn't argued that there are these secondary qualities, and the point is just to define what they are in terms of the qualities in the objects. That is, there are certain features of the primary qualities, that is, the bulk, figure, texture, and motion of sensible parts, that are powers to produce sensory ideas in us. So he gives the example that smelling a violet, the motions of the insensible, the microscopic particles cause the idea of blue color and the idea of a sweet smell. Now, Locke's further claim is that these ideas, the idea blue, the idea sweet, don't resemble the motions that come to us through light or through smell. And recalling Galileo once again, he says that this is just like the case of the sword, how it causes pain when its motion damages your body and causes pain. The sword doesn't resemble the pain, or really put it the other way is better, the pain is caused by the sword, but the pain doesn't resemble the sword. And so Locke is saying the same goes for the blue color and sweet smell of the violet. They also don't resemble. And so that is the key difference between the primary and the secondary qualities. The primary qualities cause ideas in me that resemble those qualities, whereas the secondary qualities are merely secondary because they cause ideas in me that don't resemble the qualities causing. So he still hasn't really given arguments that something like the color blue or the smell are merely secondary qualities, that they don't resemble the motions, that they don't resemble anything in the body. And so that's where these thought experiments come in. But first, Locke reminds us the basic view he's outlining here. He's saying what is sweet, blue, or warm in idea is but the certain bulk, figure, and motion of the insensible parts in the bodies themselves, which we call sweet, blue, or warm. The sword and the fire have a power to cause pain, just as the violet has a power to cause ideas of blue and sweet. And as I mentioned, it's really only through the thought experiments that come a bit later that Locke thinks he can establish that these qualities like blue, warm, and so forth are merely secondary qualities in this sense. So his first important thought experiment concerns a piece of porphyry, this kind of red with white stone that was favored in antiquity for making sculptures, seen here in a head that's from the late Roman period. People think it's Emperor Justinian. That is now in Venice. Locke says, let us consider the red and white colors in porphyry. Hinder light from striking on it, and its colors will vanish. It no longer produces any such ideas in us. Upon the return of light, it produces these appearances on us once again. Can anyone think any real alterations are made in the porphyry by the presence or absence of light, and that those ideas of whiteness and redness are really in porphyry, in the light? When it is plain, it has no color in the dark. And the rest of this paragraph is also important. The porphyry, has indeed such a configuration of particles, both night and day, as are apt, by the rays of light rebounding from some parts of that hard stone, to produce in us the idea of redness, and from others in the idea of whiteness. But whiteness and redness are not in it at any time, but such a texture that hath the power to produce such a sensation in us. In other words, Locke is saying, you can say that whiteness and redness are in the porphyry in some sense, but in what sense? Only in the sense that the porphyry has a certain texture that we know about only really in one way here, namely by its power, and a certain special kind of power, a power to produce in us certain ideas, an idea of redness, an idea of whiteness. And when we have this idea, the redness of the red idea doesn't resemble the texture. That's what makes it a secondary quality. So again, red and white are qualities of the porphyry. In some way they are in the porphyry, but they're considered secondary because we know about these qualities only because of the way that they affect our sensory capacities. So it's a difficult point to try to state clearly, this thought that the secondary qualities are qualities of objects. In that sense, they're not nothing. But because our ideas of these qualities don't resemble the qualities, all we know about the qualities are the power they have to cause these certain kinds of ideas. Red things cause red ideas. White things cause white ideas. But what's the texture? We don't know that. So the next thought experiment in the very next section, section 20, concerns an almond. He says, pound an almond, and the clear white color will be altered into a dirty one, and the sweet taste into an oily one. Now, I'm not sure, I've never done this, so I don't know exactly what difference he's talking about, but essentially he's saying when you put the almond through this mechanical process of dividing it into smaller and smaller pieces, these changes occur. And the changes concern these sensory qualities, the color, the taste. But as he says in the second sentence of that section, what real alteration can the beating of the pestle make in any body, but an alteration of the texture of it? So the change that the almond undergoes when you beat it with mortar and pestle is merely a change in the shape of the parts. So Locke's point is, if all I'm changing is the shape of it, then the change in the color and taste has to be one that is dependent on the underlying change of shape. The change of shape is the real change, a real change in the qualities, whereas the secondary qualities, the taste, the color, that's a change that is the result of the change of the texture, which is part of the real properties of the thing. Or, thought of from a different point of view, what is conceivably involved in breaking up the almond into pieces that changes a real quality called taste. The only thing you're changing is the texture. Okay, so the third thought experiment here in the next section, section 21, concerns how we feel hot and cold water depending on our own bodies and the state of our own bodies. So Locke says, top of page 117 now, ideas being thus distinguished and understood, we may be able to give an account of how the same water at the same time may produce the idea of cold by one hand and of heat by the other. Whereas it is impossible that the same water, if those ideas were really in it, should at the same time be both hot and cold. So nothing can have the same quality at the same time. The water can't really be hot and cold at the same time. But what can be the case is that the water is such as to cause a sensation of cold in one person and a sensation of hot in another person. The persons whose hands are already hot will feel the water cold, and the persons whose hands are very cold might feel the water as hot. And so this kind of relativity of the perception of the sensory qualities indicates for Locke that these qualities, hot and cold, are not real qualities in the thing, but only secondary qualities. As Locke says, continuing in that passage, for if we imagine warmth as it is in our hands to be nothing but a certain sort and degree of motion in the minute particles of our nerves or animal spirits, we may understand how it is possible that the same water may at the same time produce the sensations of heat in one hand and cold in the other. So the quality of hot and cold, those have this possibility of relativity. It depends on the observer whether something feels hot or cold. And the continuation of the passage, Locke makes the point, this is not the case for the primary qualities. As he's continuing there, he says, this, where he had just said that the water could produce these different sensations in different people, then he goes on to say, quote, which yet figure never does, that never producing the idea of a square by one hand, which has produced the idea of a globe by another. And then Locke goes on to say, if we understand the idea of heat as being the idea caused by the way the motion of the particles in the water interact with the motion of the particles in the hand, in other words, how warm is your hand, how warm or cold is the water, if that's what brings about the sensations, then we can very well understand how the water could feel hot to one person and feel cold to another. So, with these arguments in hand from these thought experiments, Locke feels entitled to the conclusion: secondary and imputed qualities are but the powers of several combinations of those primary ones when they operate without being distinctly discerned. That is, the color of the red, or the taste of the sweet almond, or the temperature, the feeling of the heat of the water, right? Those are not qualities really in the object. They're imputed qualities. They don't come from nothing. They're the powers. They are caused by something in the object. They're caused by the primary qualities of the object. But as he says in the last part of this passage I read, without being distinctly discerned. That is, when we see something red, we don't see the primary quality. We don't see the texture. Rather, the texture causes us to have a sensation of red. Similar point here, secondary qualities are nothing else but several powers in bodies depending on those primary qualities, whereby they are fitted to produce several different ideas in us. A certain texture produces red, a certain texture produces white, and the statue has those textures day or night. And so in that sense, you can say that the porphyry is red at night. But it would be a mistake to say that our idea resembles the statue. Our idea of red resembles the statue. Instead, the statue has the power to produce that idea when the conditions are right in sunlight. And Locke makes this point, I think, in a nice way back in section 17 of chapter 8, book 2. So this is actually immediately before he went through these thought experiments. He said, the particular bulk, number, figure, and motion of the parts of fire or snow are really in them, whether anyone's senses perceive them or no, and therefore they may be called real qualities, because they really exist in those bodies. He said really enough, I think, to get his point across. But light, heat, whiteness, or coldness are no more really in them than sickness or pain is in manna. Well, that's an example we didn't talk about, but you could apply those to the porphyry or the almonds and the qualities we talked about there. Take away the sensation of them, let not the eyes see light or colors, nor the ears hear sounds, let the palate not taste, nor the nose smell, and all colors, tastes, odors, and sounds, as they are such particular ideas, vanish and cease, and are reduced to their causes, i.e., bulk, figure, and motion of parts. So again, you take away the observer, you take away the human being, the colors, the tastes, the smells, they disappear. But the other side of that coin that Locke also acknowledges here is that there's still some qualities in those objects that tend to cause sensations of red or blue or sweet or a taste of sweet. Those qualities in the objects don't disappear even if the observers disappear. And I think that's the point he's making here when he says in the last part that all these colors, tastes, and odors vanish and cease, and he says, and are reduced to their causes, i.e. bulk, figure, and motion of parts. So the bulk, figure, and motion of parts, those remain when you take away observers. And so he has this idea that there's a sense that the redness of something red can be reduced to the texture, in the sense that if you take away the observer, it's just this particular texture that's left. That's what's, as he says, really in them. The texture, such as to cause human beings in the right kind of light to see red, to have that idea. So this brings up a closely related point, because he's saying that the secondary qualities are kind of power to produce ideas in us. It brings up the question about the nature of a power in general. He says a power, he called it a simple idea earlier, a power is an ability to change or act on other things. And a thing has a power by virtue of its primary or real qualities. The parts of it, the textures, could be a texture or the motion of the parts. So he says fire has a power to make lead fluid. In a later chapter he says fire has a power to melt gold, i.e. to destroy the consistency of its insensible parts and consequently its hardness. And here Locke wants to distinguish the power to melt gold from the qualities of the fire, that the motion of fire, that is the real quality that is responsible for the power, but he wants to distinguish the power to melt gold from the qualities themselves, the motion of the particles. Similarly, the sun has a power to blanch wax, to turn the wax from yellow to white. So this is relevant to our current discussion because he's said that the secondary qualities are powers to produce ideas. And now this more general account of power. Here he's saying that also the primary qualities of the fire make for a power to do something, to melt gold or lead. And we can therefore distinguish two kinds of powers. The first kind is a power that something has to affect our senses and cause ideas of colors, tastes, sounds, and so forth. These are the secondary or imputed or sensory qualities. Locke says that these are commonly thought real qualities rather than mere powers. Why? Because the powers causing sensory ideas are, in a sense, hidden from us. The texture of the red part of the porphyry and the white part of the porphyry. We don't directly see that texture. All we know is that when we look at this statue, we have the red idea, the idea of redness, and so we attribute the redness, or we commonly attribute the redness in the way that we perceive it to the object, and we think that the object resembles our ideas. And then we have those powers that we talked about before, the powers that things have to alter the qualities of other things. That, the power of the sun to blanch the wax. Locke calls these sometimes bare powers. He also calls them qualities in a third sense. So the primary qualities are the shape, the motion of particles. The secondary qualities are the way that, because of the primary qualities, the way that the thing can bring about certain sensations in us. And then the tertiary qualities are the powers, again, rooted in the primary qualities, the powers that things have to change other things. The sun has the power to blanch wax. The fire has the power to melt gold. And he says these powers are never confused to be primary, real, or original qualities. Why? Because, he says, we plainly discover that the quality produced hath commonly no resemblance to the power. In other words, both kinds of powers are a power to change something, but in the case of the secondary qualities, the cause, the texture in the case of color is hidden from us, so we impute the quality of redness to the thing itself. But in the case of these other kind of bare powers, the power of the fire to melt gold, there's no temptation to think that the fire has some kind of melting of gold quality in it. Rather the ability to melt is just something it can do. And Locke draws this distinction for us. He says, for though receiving the idea of heat or light from the sun, we are apt to think it is a perception and resemblance of such a quality in the sun, yet when we see wax or a fair face receive change of color from the sun, we cannot imagine that to be the reception or resemblance of anything in the sun, because we find not those different colors in the sun itself. So the sun causes someone with fair skin to turn red. We don't therefore say that the sun is red. And Locke is saying, in a sense, a similar mistake is being made if we think that the red that we perceive is in the statue. There's no temptation to make that mistake in the case of someone getting red from the sun, but there is that temptation in the case of the red of the porphyry, because we can't perceive the insensible texture, or the imperceptible microscopic texture that is the cause of us seeing this color rather than a different one. So this brings us to the second main topic of the lecture, the complex ideas. And we don't need to spend too long on this topic. The main point is obvious enough. The atoms of our thinking are the simple ideas, but the mind can put these together, compare them, abstract, and all of these processes to get to something more complex. When this happens, the mind considers several simple ideas united together as a single idea. These collections of simple ideas, constituting a complex idea, may either be received together through sensation and reflection, or be voluntarily joined by the mind. That is, in the sugar cube, we get the white and the sweetness together at the same time, or in other cases, we can imagine and compare and combine different ideas at will. So we can voluntarily create complex ideas, think things up, imagine things that way, but we can't voluntarily produce simple ideas. We can't imagine different simple ideas than we already have. We can only put them together, break them apart, and so forth. So the main distinction among the different kinds of complex ideas are modes, substances, and relations. This distinction between modes and substances should be somewhat familiar from Descartes and now especially from Spinoza. Locke too thinks we make this kind of distinction. Modes are not things, but are complex properties of things. They are considered as dependencies on or affections of substances. The examples he gives are triangle, murder, gratitude, beauty, theft. These aren't simple ideas that enter the mind unmixed and uniform, as he says, such as the idea of whiteness. And they're also not ideas of substances. Rather, they are a complex combination of simple ideas that are ideas of the properties of things. Substances are things in which certain properties are united. So the sweetness, the whiteness of the sugar cube, as we'll see in a bit. So you have the substances in mode, and then the third main class here are relations, bigger, smaller, cause, effect, father, son. So those are further complex ideas that we create. And so the basic structure here is you have the highest classes ideas. The simple ones are basic, the atoms, and they combine into complex ideas. And there are three basic kinds of these complex ideas. And if you look in our translation that we have at the beginning of the book, the editor puts together this chart not made by Locke, and I haven't examined this in great detail, but it's kind of interesting here. You can see this breakdown is not a table of contents, but here he's saying here are the simple ideas and where they come from, and the complex ideas of modes, substances, and relations, and just to give you a sense at least of what the breakdown here is of where all of our ideas come from, how we categorize them. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about the idea of substance in particular, and his criticism of other thinkers, not named, but criticism of this employment of this concept of substance in this metaphysical sense. And that discussion is going to give us a good sense of Locke's approach to philosophical questions, to metaphysics, and how his empiricism informs his way of thinking about metaphysics, or what kind of anti-metaphysical view of these matters he might have. And so I'm going to conclude this video with one final quote from chapter 12 here, talking about the way we combine these simple ideas into these different kinds of complex ideas. He says, even the most abstruse or abstract ideas, however remote they may seem from any operations of our own minds, are yet only such as the understanding frames of itself. Or, I think in contemporary English you'd probably say frames by itself, or I guess makes by itself. They are only such ideas as the understanding itself makes, by repeating and conjoining together ideas that it had either from objects of sense or from its own operations about them. And so the humble origin of our ideas in sensation and reflection, Locke is saying, are not going to prevent us from gaining knowledge. Although, as we mentioned already in the first video, he does have a conception of knowledge as being limited. And that's going to be something we're going to be examining in later videos. But actually, I want to just, before I wrap up this video, just look at one more passage that kind of sums up nicely, I think, the attitude he has to these questions. So, reflecting back on what he's shown in these passages that in chapters we've looked at already, this is now in chapter 12 of Book 2. How is it that our simple ideas get combined to complex ideas and so forth? Locke says, and thus I have given a short and, I think, true history of the first beginnings of human knowledge, whence the mind has its first objects, and by what steps it makes its progress to the laying in and storing up those ideas out of which is to be framed all the knowledge it is capable of. Wherein I must appeal to experience and observation whether I am in the right, the best way to come to truth being to examine things as they really are, and not to conclude they are as we fancy of ourselves or have been taught by others to imagine. So he's saying, I have this kind of empirical method of investigating the mind, this true history of the mind, to see what the origin of our various ideas are. That's going to be where he's going to look, and he associates this empiricist method with a enlightenment ideal of thinking for oneself, as opposed to the dogmatism of being told how things are by other people. And so that's all I'll say in this video. And so for the next video, for time reasons, we're going to skip over the discussion of free will that Locke has, even though it's interesting, and move on to his discussion of our ideas of substance. That means we're going to skip over reading 8.3 and move on to topic 9 and reading 9.1, and within 9.1 only item E, which is the topic Locke on the metaphysics of substance.